Today is Ezekiel, but actually we're going to cover some of the prophetic portions of both Daniel and Ezekiel, and really not going to cover much of Ezekiel at all, just a couple of really specific portions, but a lot of it has to do with eschatology and the study of prophecy. So it's a pretty detailed section, and you might be a little bit overwhelmed with it, but as I always say to you at this time of the semester, as I said several times before, you can't coast out, right? Focus till the end, and so start right now and do your best to get this, because yes, it's actually going to be on the celebration, right? The final celebration, just to encourage you to go after it and pay attention. So let's take a look at Daniel and his prophecies. Eschatology is the study of things to come. Now, before we get into the whole thing of the actual prophecies, I just want to talk to you a little bit about the climate in which we live. Because having been as old as I am, I've seen the climate change quite a bit. And here's what I'm talking about. When we think about history, we typically think of in a linear way. When you think about, okay, what is life like today in 2015, or in round numbers, the middle half of the second decade here, it was a lot more advanced than it was in 1995, and a lot more advanced than it was in 1975, right? So we think, okay, the progress is moving, always that way. But the trouble is that progress doesn't always work like that. It doesn't work like that with everything. For example, some things work more like a pendulum. I remember watching a tank movie with Brad Pitt in it last year or year before, called Fury, something like that. And I was always interested in watching a World War II movie because I like all the period pieces in the history and like, okay, what were things like? And one of the first things I noticed was his hair was really short on the sides and long on top. And I thought, no, wait a minute, come on. What are they giving the guy a modern haircut for, right? And they realized, oh, duh, no, this is what it was like in the 40s, right? And things are just not a cyclical thing. And clothing styles and hairstyles and a lot of other things like that do swing back and forth, right? There's really nothing new. You think it's new because you don't know history, but it's really not new. And so the similar thing has happened when it comes to this study of eschatology. And I want to say this. In 1975, there was a huge fever pitch about studying prophecy. And when I would do this, when I would teach classes, at that point in time, people knew all about it, right? We didn't hardly even had to talk about it because everybody just knew it in their churches. Now, in 2015 and the second half of this decade, it's almost like the pendulum has swung completely the other way, and you hardly ever hear about it in most churches. Why is that? Well, let me give you a little bit of balance here, right? Because one Christian theologian has said the only time the church is in the middle is when the pendulum is swinging from side to side, right? We never can quite get it right. We're always going back and forth or something. I want to try to get it right? I want to try to give the right emphasis on it and not just give into a fad. So here is the history which you need to know, right? I'm going to go all the way back to show you some of the background here. In 70 AD, this is when Jerusalem is destroyed by the Romans for the first time, all right? The temple is smashed flat again, 500 years after Nebuchadnezzar did it, but the Romans do it in 70 AD because the Jewish people are still kind of excited. They got messianic fever in their bones. The reason why they have messianic fever in their bones is because of some of the prophecies we're going to look at in Daniel today. Daniel says that at this point in time, Messiah is going to come near here. And if you don't believe Jesus was, there were a whole lot of other guys who popped up and said, yeah, I'm Messiah, believe it or not. Right? And they really did that. And so people were so interested in getting rid of the Romans off their back, they were willing to follow anybody who kind of made a promise that they could make Israel independent again. Right? So anyway, in 70 AD, Jerusalem is destroyed. And then in 135, there's a guy named Bar Kokhba. That's the person's name, the son of Kokhba, okay, who comes along, and he also claims to be a Messiah, right, a deliverer. And sure enough, a whole bunch of people follow him. And the Romans come in again and say, okay, enough is enough is enough, and they destroy everything again. And they say, we're tired of coming down here and doing these mop-up operations. All you Jews you're gone. Right? So they kick the Jewish people out of the land of Palestine forever. Right? It is not legal for Jewish people to live there. And this lasts for millennia. Right? So the Jews are gone in 135, and it's very, very easy to think at this point that God is done with Israel, right? And so for a long time in theology, people don't give much credence to the future and to prophecy, right? So then comes 1948. In 1948, the Jews are allowed back into the land. Israel becomes a nation again. Now you can imagine here for the reason why, because now the entire world is sympathetic to them because of the Holocaust, right? People didn't want to notice this, didn't want to think about it during the war, right? And it wasn't really well publicized. But after the war, 1945, it becomes clear, okay, this is what the Germans were doing. And 6 million Jewish people died. And all of a sudden people feel this sympathy and think, oh gosh, let's let them have their own place, their own space to live. Now that was incredible, because it's the first time in almost 2,000 years Israel has that, okay? So all of a sudden people say, whoa, Israel is a nation again, okay? And in 1948, all of the Arab nations around, as soon as they're declared independent, Arab nations invade and try to destroy them. Well, they are able to repel, and they are, stabilized for a little while. And then, in 1967, the whole thing happens again. All of the Arab nations around, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, decide to invade and put an end to this Jewish menace once for all. And in 1967, they fought back, and it's referred to in history as the miracle Six-Day War, because it really does feel like that to everybody, even people who aren't believers. You realize this is 1967, just 20 years removed from World War II, where it took at least 6 years, right, to finish this whole thing. In 1967, the United States is still in the middle of an 11-year conflict in Vietnam that they can't figure out and they can't overcome. In 6 days, the Jewish people not only repel the invasion into their land, but start to take back that land and take back more. And by the time those 6 days were over, they were marching within 50 miles of Cairo, ready to actually conquer Egypt. This is just absolutely boggles the mind, completely unheard of. And everybody, again, even unbelievers are saying, whoa, what is going on here, right? So let me show you what the map looks like here. Before 1967, Israel did not own the Golan Heights, did not own the West Bank, did not own the Sinai Peninsula. Right? But after 67, they invaded and took the Golan Heights, which is a really high mountain where the enemy would shoot down on them all the time, so it was nice to take control of that high ground. They took all the West Bank, which included Jerusalem. They took all of the Sinai Peninsula, and they were within 50 miles of Cairo, and then the United Nations stepped in and said, hold on, time out, everybody. We don't want Israel to conquer the entire Arab world, so we got to put a stop to this right here. Right? So this was not just a giant military victory for them. It was a statement that went throughout the world and went throughout religious world, and all of a sudden people said, hey, we better read our Bibles more carefully. Right? And what they were saying was, hey, maybe God does have a future for this nation, because clearly this is a God thing. That's what everybody would say. Okay? So people really, really got interested in prophecy, and it became a fever pitch to talk about it. And in 1988, I'll just kind of skip to the end here. In 1988, there was a guy who came out with a book that was entitled 88 Reasons Why Jesus is Coming Back in 1988. Now, obviously, from our perspective, this looks really, really dumb. But what you have to realize is at this point in time, because of this focus on Israel and God being, good to Israel, it sure looked like all this prophecy was coming true. And it's like everybody, even serious Bible students, looked and thought, oh, wait, is this true, right? Is there something else we have missed, right? Is Jesus coming back in 1988? Right? Well, obviously he doesn't do that, and so the guy has the gall to come out with a book the next year, 89 Reasons, and so what was this fever pitch thing, and then people start making these kind of predictions, then becomes sort of silly, right? And so it doesn't take very long for this to happen. So in 1948, 1967, this fever pitch starts to build, right? And then by the time we get to here, people are like, oh man, we're just embarrassed about this. We don't want to talk about it anymore. We're looking really silly in front of the world, and so let's not even talk about it, right? So the pendulum swings here. So in 1975, that's all people are talking about. 40 years later in 2015, people are embarrassed to talk about it. We don't even talk about it when it comes up in the scriptures. Right? And that's why today I want to dig in pretty deep into Daniel, the prophetic portions of Daniel, and actually talk about prophecy, which is not in vogue, and which I don't know if your churches have talked to you about it or have conferences on it or not. They're probably a whole lot more likely to talk about, current issues in the Christian life and not to talk about this. But I think it's pretty important to do this. To not be in the middle, only when the pendulum is swinging from side to side, to try to do what Paul says in Acts, and that is teach the whole counsel of God. Right? And let's talk about it, whether or not people have abused it in the past or not. So, here's where we're going to go. What is eschatology good for? What is the study of prophecy good for? First answer, making very cool and complex charts like this one, which is one I had to memorize when I was in high school. My dad was a youth leader and was teaching it. Right? Or making bad movies like this one. Anybody ever seen this one? If you haven't, don't. Right? I mean, this is a horrible movie. It's on Netflix, and I figured, one time, I think last summer, I thought, it's been out for a while. At least I should see it just to see what's going on. I watched it. It was 2 hours of my life I'll never get back. I'm serious. This is really bad. Don't even think about it. The only thing they have going for them, it's like the producer had this bright idea, that when the rapture comes, that people will be nakedly raptured and leave all their clothes in piles. So that's about what the whole movie is. Oh, there's another pile of clothes. Look at that. Okay, that's all you got? And don't see it, right? So no, it's not for making bad movies. It is for this, encouraging believers that God will finally reclaim this hijacked world when it appears he has walked off the job. So let that soak in for a little bit, right? That is really what it is about. And you can imagine why in 586 or in 536, this is really important because of our discussion last Friday about the book of Daniel. And remember the little sandbox and Billy the Babylonian, right? Remember that whole discussion? Well, the point is that when Jerusalem gets destroyed here, it does look like God's walked off the job. Like, wow, how could that have happened, right? And we're encouraged by the book of Daniel that it wasn't because God was weak, but it's still, there's this lingering sense that's true. And especially when they come back in 536, and they don't have a king, and there isn't a glory cloud in the temple, there's just this sense like, God, are you has your plan run off the rails? And so prophecy comes along where God says, no, here's the long-term plan. I do have a long-term plan. I know right now in the short term it doesn't look like it, but there is a long-term plan, and here's what it is. And so you end up with prophecy in those kinds of times. You also end up with it a lot in the New Testament because Messiah comes, dies, goes up to heaven, doesn't come back. And people again are thinking, wait, hold on. When Messiah came, why didn't he stay? And if he's gone, is he coming back? And so you get the book of Revelation and more prophecy that says, yes, God still has a long-term plan, even though it looks like it's been delayed from your standpoint, and it will happen, okay? So let me just introduce you to some of the prophecy in the book of Daniel. Now, when we covered the sandbox stories, we didn't look at the content of the chapters. We just looked at the bottom line of them, but it's marvelously coherent in this sense. In chapter 2 and chapter 7 and chapter 8, it really, even though it uses different figures, is talking about the same thing. And what it's talking about is this, that there will be a succession of at least 4 major dominant nations, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, at least dominant in the sense of Israel's life, which will come before major things start to happen. Right? Major things meaning Messiah. Okay. So over here in chapter 2, this is the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had, which he wanted the actual vision and the interpretation of. Remember, a head of gold, chest of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron. And all of these were decreasing in value because the actual governments became a little bit weaker as it went on. But what happens is this. You've got a lion, and then the bear eats the lion, the leopard eats the bear, and then this terrifying, frightening beast happens. But what happens at the bottom of all these things is something very similar. In chapter 2, what happens is this, at the very end of it. There is a mountain cut out without hands. meaning humans didn't have anything to do with it. Right? There is a government coming. There's this big rock, this big mountain comes, and it hits the statue, it just obliterates it into dust. Right? And the idea is that God's kingdom is going to come and supplant human kingdoms. Well, down here, there's this terrifying, frightening beast, which is probably a reference to an Antichrist, come, and there's going to be one like a son of man. This is a very messianic reference. In fact, Jesus even uses it at the critical point in his trial, right? When he's there on trial and the high priest says, "Do you make yourself out to be the Son of God? You've blasphemed against us," right? And Jesus says, "Well, that may be, but I'll tell you what, someday you're going to see the Son of Man," Daniel 7 reference, "coming on clouds." And they said, "You claim to be the Son of Man, you claim to be Messiah." And then they rip their clothes and they crucify him, right? But he's talking about the one who's going to come and destroy this Antichrist and establish his kingdom completely. So in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, you've got this whole succession of, okay, in time, it's all going to happen, all right? Now, I'm not going to ask you on the test to know details about all this. The only thing you need to know about all that stuff is simply this, right? The future is merely history to God, and his promises will become reality in due time. You can write it down later. Where I want to go now is this, right? Daniel's 77s. Now, this is stuff I do want you to know. And if you look over here, over somewhere, where did I put that? There we go. If you look in the notes, you got this chart here, which we just looked at. But then down here, we have the prophecy of 70 weeks or 77s. And you'll notice that I put the chart in there at least 3 times because there's going to be so many things you're going to want to write down and note to it. You also have the text of Daniel, those 4 verses, 24, 5, 6, and 7, right there to work from. And then, if you look down here, you're going to see the same kind of chart laid out, and it is explained down here. So there's a little bit of hope, right? If you can't quite follow the PowerPoint, you got a little bit of explanation right here to know what's going on. And at various points in the time, I'm going to talk about this little book by Harold Hoehner, Chronological Aspects of the Life of Christ, because we're going to get into some really, really detailed chronology that you're hardly ever going to remember, but I want you to know that this is the kind of stuff that some scholars have worked out for us, and I'll refer to it, and that's the reference by the book, okay, by the author. So let me go back over here and talk about Daniel's 77s. Now, we have actually looked at Daniel 9 before when we were studying something. What were we studying? We were studying Kings and Chronicles, remember? Kings and Chronicles, we talked about kings being a call for repentance. And we said the very first response to it was made by Daniel in Daniel chapter 9. So I'm going to go back to that. It's going to look a little bit familiar. Then we're going to go further. Right? So here is Daniel chapter 9. In the first year of Darius, son of Xerxes' descent, in the first year of his reign, so this is in 536 BC, Daniel is sitting over here in Babylon. Remember, he was deported in 605. So that's 69 and a half years ago. So he's sitting here reading, "I, Daniel, understood from the Scriptures according to the word of the Lord given to Jeremiah the prophet." He's actually reading Jeremiah chapter 25. He's reading Jeremiah, and Jeremiah says, okay, this whole thing is going to last for 70 years. He looks at his calendar and thinks, whoa, it's about time, right? So instead of packing his bags, he does what he should do from 1 Kings, and he begins to repent, right? "So I turned to the Lord God and pleaded with him in prayer and petition and fasting and sackcloth and ashes. I prayed to the Lord my God and confessed." Right? This is exactly what you're supposed to do. And he does that, right? He does that because he knows Deuteronomy 30 is the call for it. So in Deuteronomy 30, if we go back here, the word return, repent, same word. When God disperses you, he is dispersed, he's in exile. And so he begins to repent on behalf of himself and his people. If you repent, the Lord God your God will restore your fortunes, have compassion on you, and gather you again from all the nations where he scattered you, right? So he's thinking, okay, God's going to take us back. And then what it says here is he will make you more prosperous and numerous than your fathers. The Lord your God will circumcise your hearts and hearts of your descendants, so you may love him with all your heart, with all your soul, and live. So when Daniel is here, and he's reading in Jeremiah, and he's going back to Deuteronomy 30, what he's thinking in his mind is, okay, this is it, man. This is it. God's going to take us back. God's going to circumcise our hearts. New covenant is going to happen. Messiah is going to come. And this is where the kingdom is going to come. So he's repenting for all of his might, excited about what God has in store. I mean, just imagine that you thought in the next couple of weeks the kingdom was going to come. And I'm not talking about vacation. I'm talking about the kingdom actually comes. Right? Jesus comes back. That's the actual kind of excitement that he has here. Okay? So here's what happens to him. While he's praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, making my request to the Lord my God for Jerusalem, his holy hill, an angel comes and says, now the angel has to come and say this to him, right, just to kind of straighten him out a little bit. As soon as you began to pray, an answer was given, which I have come to tell you. Here's what the angel then says. And basically, what the angel is going to say is this is just my summary. The immediate restoration to the land here in 536, when people go back, after these 70 years of exile, is not the full restoration of Deuteronomy 30. So Daniel's sitting over here, and the angel says, I have good news and bad news. The bad news is, when we go back and when we return from the land, the kingdom is not going to come. Daniel says, what? What? I thought this was it. And the angel says, no, here's the good news. The good news is that there is a definite period of time in which it will come. But it's longer than you thought, bud. Okay? It's not just 70 years. In fact, it's going to be 70 times 7 years. So there's a bundle of 490 years before it all happens, but it will happen. All right? You with me? So some good news and bad news to the whole thing. The full Deuteronomy 30 restoration will not happen for at least 70 times 7, 490 more years. Now, in King James, they're called weeks because the week is the number. The word week or 7 is the same Hebrew word, okay? So it's not really 70 weeks as though it were, you get the idea. It's 70 groups of 7 years. So here's the way the whole thing is going to lay out. He says, it turns out there's this kind of mountaintop thing with prophets, Daniel, that I got to tell you about. And you're looking here at 536. But there's going to be another group of years that might take us till 33 or might take us till 2024. And you might say, what? Wait a minute. How come such a disparity? Well, I'll explain that as we go. But what he's saying is basically it's not going to happen here. It might happen here or maybe here. And I'll show you why he says this. Okay? So let's take a look at it. Is it this one? Is it this one? Is it this one? I don't know. And eventually I'm going to give you 24 reasons why I think it's 20. I'll show you what the numbers mean here in a second, okay? So, is it there, or is it there? So here is the first major kind of summary. And this summary isn't going to make a whole lot of sense to you yet. He's going to explain it in verses 25, 6, and 7. Right? So stay with me. I want you to know this. Right? So here's kind of the summary of what he's going to say. 77s, so 490 years, are decreed for you and your people, your holy city, to, and then he says 6 things. Number 1, finish transgression. Number 2, put an end to sin. Number 2, atone for wickedness. Number 3, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Now, you look at all that stuff and think, has that stuff happened yet, even now? And the answer is what? Actually, kind of. A lot of that stuff hasn't happened, right? Because we haven't finished transgression. Haven't done that. Have we put an end to sin? Just look at your roommate's life, right? No, right? Have we atoned for wickedness? Oh, wait a minute. There has been an atonement, hasn't there? Right? And that is true. When you look at this, I think, I don't see that we've brought in everlasting righteousness. Haven't done that. We haven't sealed up vision and prophecy. We haven't put prophecy to bed because we are already in the future. Right? That's what it means. And we haven't anointed the most holy, but it does look like there was an atonement for wickedness right about in here somewhere. Okay? And I would argue that the rest of that stuff is going to take place here. Right? Now, again, this doesn't make any sense to you yet because Daniel hasn't explained it to us. But you get the big idea that the kingdom is going to come, but it's going to take a while. Right? And at least this much time period for it to happen. So, let's let Daniel explain what he's talking about here in verse 24, and he does that in the next 3 verses. So, the explanation for this is Daniel 9:25. Know and understand this, from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Now, that happens actually in 445. Because you realize that these 77s, this group of 490 years, doesn't actually even start in Daniel's time. It doesn't start until the decree to restore the city. This is in Nehemiah chapter 2. Nehemiah records it. There's a definite date in 445 BC where the king of Persia says, okay, I want to go back and rebuild the city. In 536, he let the people go back, but there wasn't a decree to actually rebuild the city until 445. You say, what? Why is the date so important? Hang on, you'll find out. Right? 445. So, from the issue of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, and you know what that sounds like in Hebrew, right? Messiah, right? Until the Messiah, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. So, Messiah is going to come right down here at some point. And in between there is going to be 7 sevens, which is 49 years, and 62 sevens, which is 434 years. You say, why the mystery here? Well, I don't know exactly, but this is the way he explains it, okay? So you got a total of 483 years. Now, this is why I mentioned to you that little book by the guy named Harold Hoehner, right? Harold Hoehner has gone back and done the painstaking work. I mean, it's almost, I'm glad, I've read the book once. I'm really, really glad I did. It's very convincing, but I'm really thankful I didn't have to write the book, okay? Or read it a second time, right? It's one of those books that's like, oh man, he has to go back and take a look at all the chronology, all of the new moons, and you can do that, you know, with astronomical charts now. And he has to account for leap years and even leap centuries. And he does all that stuff and works it out. And he says, hey, you never believe what happened here. And here's what happened. When you go back here and you take a look at this, it turns out that the date of the triumphal entry, and again, I'm not making this up. You can all look in the book. Harold Hoehner was actually one of my professors. He was the head of the doctoral program at Dallas Seminary. This guy's no slouch, right? He's a real scholar's scholar. He says that the date of the triumphal entry is March 29th, 33 AD. You say, can you really do that? Yeah, read Hoehner. Check it out, right? This is the date of the triumphal entry. Is that an important day? And the answer is absolutely it's an important day. Here's why. It's also what we call Palm Sunday. But it's important, in fact, some ways more important than the date of the crucifixion, because the date of the triumphal entry is when Jesus comes in and presents himself as Messiah. So for 3.5 years, it's like he's been running for office. Today we would say, okay, the Palm Sunday is actually election day. Right? He's been running for office, and the election day comes, and he presents his case and says, he gets on a little donkey and rides into town just like Solomon did. And he says, okay, here I am, the ultimate son of David. Do you want me to reign over you? And what do they say? They ultimately say no, right? They say, yeah, you get these hosannas. Oh, yes, save us now from Rome, but not save us from sin. And they eventually say, no, out of here, okay? But this is the day he presents himself. Now, when he comes in, he recognizes that this reception is illegitimate, it's superficial, it's not good enough, and he leaves, right? And he says this: if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it's hidden from your eyes, this is the day, right? Why? Well, because as we're going to find out, when you add in those, you start with 360-day years, because this is what Daniel used. 360-year years. Add in the leap years, add in the leap centuries. You know what you find? This comes out to the very day of 483 of those years after the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. So that, we know it because you can read about it in cartoons, right? This came out on Palm Sunday several years ago. Peter calls it the prophecy which very few knew. I'll say that's for sure. About 500 years before Jesus was born, make that 500 BC, an angel named Gabe told a prophet named Dan just how many days it would be. From the edict to rebuild Jerusalem till Messiah the King would ride through its gate came out to a 173,880-day wait. No kidding, right? All those days in those years, okay? Generations of faithful descendants would cross off the days as the years dwindled down, and the final day came as Dan had proclaimed. Guess who rode into that town on that very day, right? And this is actually astounding. This is almost like someone divine planned it out ahead of time. Almost like that. And so Jesus actually comes on the right day and presents himself as Messiah. Now, if the date of the triumphal entry is March 29, 33 AD, as Honer proclaims, and I believe he's absolutely right, notice this, and this is the ominous part. Then verse 26 says, after the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be cut off. Cut off is, Old Testament language for be killed. And so it is after this day that he is cut off. But it's interesting. See, here are the 62, which really are, you add that, it's really, 69 of the groups of 7 are done here. But after this 62, it's cut off. Now, it's interesting to me that it says after. It doesn't say in the final group of 7. Right? That's why there's this break right here. Because there's a bunch of stuff that's going to happen after this, but before this. All right? So that's why there's this little break in the chart. Now watch what happens. After the 62, the anointed one will be cut off and will have nothing. So we're going to put the crucifixion right here. And it says he will have nothing. What does it mean have nothing? Well, he expected to get, or he wanted to get, he came to get the kingdom. But he has no kingdom. It's been taken away. He's been killed and crucified, right? So the anointed one is cut off and will have nothing. And then notice what happens here in verse 26. After 67s, the anointed will be cut off and have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Now, there's only one event in history that could possibly refer to, and that is in 70 AD, right? It's the only time when the city gets destroyed, besides 586, but we're well past that, right? So in 70 AD, Jerusalem gets destroyed by Rome. So after the 62 sevens, you got the death of Messiah and the destruction of the city. So now we've got, 40 years here in this gap, okay? The people of the ruler who will come. Now, let me make a couple distinctions here. When we say the ruler who will come, you realize we're not talking about Jesus anymore, right? Jesus is the anointed one, but then we've got the ruler who will come. So now we've got another Christ, actually a false Christ, sometimes known as an antichrist, okay? And you know that because his people are the ones who destroy the city. So this guy is Roman. This guy is Jewish. Okay, you with me so far? So we're moving on then. The people of the ruler who will come, right? This ruler, this Antichrist, is not here now, but his people are in 70 AD. They're the ones who destroy the city. They destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. Now, all this stuff seems like it's going to take a while, and it does, right? All of the history of Israel after this point, like with the Bar Kokhba revolt and all this sort of stuff, even the Holocaust, the Inquisitions. Just watch The Fiddler on the Roof and you hear about it, right? All that stuff takes a long, long time, and what we're doing here is we're talking about what life is going to be like in this gap period in here. Then in verse 27, we're actually going to pick up with this last group of years. Okay? So watch verse 27. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. Now, notice carefully the antecedent to he. Who is the he that we're talking about here? The Antichrist. Yeah, this is not the Christ. We're talking about the Antichrist now, okay? He, this ruler who will come in the future, when he does come, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. So we're talking about this last group of 7 years here, okay? The 70th 7. So there's going to be a covenant of peace for 7 years that this guy is going to initiate. In the middle of the 7 years, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. So right here in the middle, there is sacrifice and offering at the temple. Now, there's a whole lot of implications even behind this, right? Because I'm going to show you, if I have time, some pictures of the Dome of the Rock today. And the Dome of the Rock is sitting up on the Temple Mount. Dome of the Rock is actually sitting on the very place where Solomon's temple originally stood. You know why they put it there? They put it there because there's a saying in Israel, and all over the Middle East, I guess, once a holy spot, always a holy spot. And that is, the reason why they put the Dome of the Rock there is because they said, we don't want those stinking Jews rebuilding another temple ever. And so, in order to prevent that from happening, we'll put the Dome of the Rock here because they can't just build their temple anywhere. They have to build it there. And if they would if they would try to build it where the Dome of the Rock is, that would create World War III. So that's why they build it there. Right? Now, if in fact, at this point in time, we're going to have a temple which is offering sacrifices, this guy is going to have to be an amazing peacemaker who somehow negotiates the Dome of the Rock down and the temple up. Right? That's why there's this covenant for 7 years, and there is offerings taking place at the temple. In the middle of it, though, he puts an end to it, and on the wing of the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation. Now, Jesus talks about this in Matthew 24 and 25, and the book of Revelation talks about it as well, right? Jesus refers to this phrase, and perhaps you remember it from the Gospels. The abomination that causes desolation. What is that? Well, it's probably when he goes into the temple, proclaims himself to be God. Now, I'm drawing this from the book of Revelation and Matthew, far beyond what Daniel does, but Daniel is the foundation for it. Okay? So at the middle point of the tribulation, the Antichrist here proclaims himself to be God, and that's why the second group of the second half of the tribulation is so bad. Now, some people say, how do you know these groups are actual years? Well, again, in the book of Revelation, it describes a half of those 7 years in 3 different ways. It calls it a time, times 2, and half a time, right? 3.5 years. It also calls it 42 months, right? Figure out how long 42 months is. It also calls it 1,260 days. And you put all those together, you realize, oh, we're really talking about real live years here, okay? So the abomination causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him at the second coming there. Now, I know that's a whole bunch of information, but here's the sad part. Your pastors or your teachers probably haven't given you any heads up about that or any foundation for it, so that all that is just overwhelmingly fire hose new. When I first started doing this 35, 40 years ago, it was like, okay, been there, done that. We know all this. Right? That's the pendulum swing we're talking about. So even at the risk of fire hosing you, I want to tell you what generations in the past have kind of known already, right? And we should know as well. There's no reason why we should be ignorant about this stuff. The amazing part to me is this. When you look at this, those last 7 years there that we typically call tribulation period, sometimes in Christian circles today, because we're embarrassed about the focus on prophecy, we're embarrassed to even talk about this. I mean, oh yeah, how can we be sure of that interpretation? Right? Is that really true? Is Jesus really going to come back? Are those Left Behind novels really true? Well, I'm not going to, base my theology on Left Behind novels. But I do want to say, on the authority of Daniel and Revelation, you know what? if these first 483 years happened and were fulfilled so literally up to the day, and then there seems like there's a break between that and the last 7 years, who am I to say that these last 7 years are not going to be fulfilled literally just like the first ones were? And so I just want to show that to you and show you some of the history that's gone behind it to encourage you, you know what, this is not just fairy tale stuff. This is not embarrassing stuff. This is actually what the Bible teaches, and I'm going to teach it unashamedly. All right? So, depending upon your background, that may be new or may not be new to you, but that's the basic idea of Daniel's 77s. Now, again, I know it's probably pretty overwhelming in a lot of ways, but is there anything I can answer for you? What questions do you have I can answer for you to help make this make sense? How much coffee do you have? Yeah. Yeah, I think we're still in this break, and the way we'll know that last 7 has started is when he shows up and confirms a peace treaty with many Jews, Muslims, everybody for 1/7. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so now do you understand the 2024? Yeah, it can't happen before 7 years from now, right? So, next January I'll have to change it to 2025. Okay? All right? Yeah. Yes, that would be what Paul and Jesus call the tribulation. Yeah. Yeah, those last 7 years. Yeah. How do we know we're not in tribulation now? Well, one of the reasons I would think, are you talking about the actual 7 years, those things? Yeah, right. Some people think it's a figurative thing. It's like, okay, you can't really get too literal about this. And the reason I say that is because, hey, wait, when you go back here and notice from 445 to March 29th, man, that was to the day. If that's the day, then why are we saying this stuff is hard to figure out or it's figurative? I don't think it is. I think I'm expecting, unless something's changed, I'm expecting those to be just as literal as those were. Yeah. Good question. But again, part of the reason people say that is when someone comes out and says 88 reasons why Jesus come in 1988, and then he doesn't come, it just makes everybody look stupid, right? And so you just kind of, you naturally tend to shy away from that kind of specificity and say, but again, there's a big difference between trying to say these are literal and Jesus is coming in 1988, right? There's no reason in the Bible to think 1988 is the day. There is reason in the Bible to think that these 7 years are going to be literally true. So you don't lump the goofballs in with real scholars and don't shy away from what the Bible actually does teach. Okay. Then, with that, let me talk to you a little bit about where this is going to fit in our scheme. And I trust that you have done your homework and taken a look at those videos from when I was gone in Micah. And if you have, you know what Micah is doing up right there, right? If you haven't, you need to do that before the celebration. But we've got Genesis 3:15, 12:49, 2 Samuel 7, Micah 5, and now I want to put Daniel 9 right there on top of it. And those first 4 are going to talk about who, right? They're talking about who does he come from? Eve, Abraham, Judah, and David. And then Micah answers what question? Where in Bethlehem, and Daniel answers what question? When? Yeah, if you figure it out, you can know, right? and even in when Jesus is born, as you read Luke chapter 2, you'll read about the old woman and the old man who are waiting at the temple for the redemption of Israel because they know it's about time, right? And this, again, is why you get the revolts in 70 and even 135, right? Because people are saying it's about this time. Because Daniel had set everybody up to say, okay, about 4 centuries from now, right, or 4 or 5 centuries from now, that's when Messiah is going to come. Right? So at least in that ballpark there, people are thinking about it. Okay, then Ezekiel, very briefly. Not the whole thing, but very briefly. Ezekiel, here's a good way to think of him. Ezekiel's going to be really mad at me for this, but just hoping when I see him coming in heaven, I'm going to avoid him. Ezekiel is the Jeremiah of Babylon. And what I mean is this. What Jeremiah is doing in his book is saying to the people, look, the reason why the exile is coming is because you have been so obstinate and rejected God's words. Well, Ezekiel is over here in Babylon doing the same thing. Now, you might think, well, the people who had been exiled over here already, even before 586, right? In 605 and in 597, people had been exiled over here. And Ezekiel's ministering to them. You'd think that they would know, well, duh, we did something wrong. And the answer is no. No, they don't. They just think, hey, it's a string of bad luck that their army's bigger than our army. And Ezekiel comes along and says, no, the reason why you're here is because you have, rejected God, and Deuteronomy 20 has been fulfilled. So, in some sense, the book of Ezekiel is the same message as Jeremiah. Just a different spot, a different group of people. Where I want to go, though, with this is I want to show you a couple of charts and pictures of Jerusalem and talk about the temple. Now, on this picture, which is about Jesus' time, but close enough to Hezekiah's time as well, the first thing you should notice is that this is the original city of David. Then up here, the temple is that little T-shaped deal right there, and this is the temple courts right there. It doesn't look very big on the map, but trust me, it gets pretty good size, right? So I'm going to go to the similar map, but now it's three-dimensional, okay? City of David down here, the temple up here, there's the T-shaped deal. This section right here, that big rectangle, is the size of about 17 football fields, right? So imagine 17 of them. That's a really big space. That little deal right there, which you can barely even see, called Robinson's Arch, I want to zoom in on that a little bit, and you get a sense for the immensity of this. Right? There's Robinson's Arch. Okay? That little thing right there that you can barely see up close is going to look like this. So this temple is just this amazing, monstrous, imposing structure. You can see the people on it here walking up to the temple, which is over here. The temple itself is over 70 feet high. So if you couldn't, but if you were a priest and you could walk in, it would be like 70 feet high in the atrium. Now, if you've ever been to a big city with a hotel like that where the atrium goes up, 18 stories, you get a sense of, whoa, this feeling of majesty. And that's exactly how you're supposed to feel when you walk in the temple. Wow, God is big. God's bigger than I am, right? And this whole thing has a pretty large proportion to it. Now, here is, we're looking at from the east. This is the temple itself. Again, see the T shape going back, sort of. And this is the 17 football field area. This is where Jesus would have run the money changers out. This is where they would set up. But let me show you what this looks like inside, okay? You go inside of it. That's from the model. But you go inside of it, it looks like this. So it's this really majestic, beautiful structure that's really, really huge. So what we're going to focus then is here's the Temple Mount, and I'm going to focus in, show you a picture from what it looks like from there, from the west, okay? You're from the west looking to the east, because here's the Mount of Olives out here, and today that's what it looks like, right? Remember what I told you? Where'd they put the Dome of the Rock? Right smack dab in the spot where the temple was. Now, they do that because they don't want anybody building temples there. And the interesting thing is, as beautiful as this is, and that's actually trimmed out in gold, real gold, right? They have to polish it up every year or so. The temple itself, this stands about 40 feet high. The temple would have stood up at least this high, much more imposing than the Dome of the Rock is there. So we're going to zoom in on this spot here and talk about Ezekiel's vision of when God leaves the temple.